Hi, my wonderful U.S. history students. Here's another video as we continue our second unit. And this is some of the social changes. We're focusing on how the colonies changed from the 1600s to the 1700s. And here's some features central to the 1700s. And excuse me for my noisy dogs. All right, but this here is the Great Awakening. I want you to take a minute to look at this image someone drew of this event. Notice the amount of people there. There was no social distancing in the 1700s. Notice in the back, it looks like people are camping out to attend this event. So here's some background. So it was, from generally speaking, the 1730s to the 1770s, really had its height in the 1730s. And it was this religious movement that swept through the colonies. The message that the people received was that they should examine their lives, that God was beautiful and kind, but he could also get really angry and really upset. And if you did not follow the Bible, they would be sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? So this wasn't the peaceful, loving, hippie Jesus. This was the I'm going to be really mad at you if you sin Jesus. So this did not begin in America. The revival of these Protestant beliefs was part of a much bigger movement that took place in England and Scotland and Germany. So not all over the world, but in a lot of the Protestant parts of the world. So many different preachers were focused here. So remember, back in world history, we focused on some of the Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. So you have preachers here, but they're not all trying to make different denominations, so to speak, but they're all giving this message. And they thought people need to confess their sins and devote themselves completely to God. So this was popular in Europe, but it was even more popular in the American colonies. So tens of thousands of colonists who weren't even really religious before converted to some of these various Protestant beliefs. So notice Protestantism, I'm not really talking about Catholics here. There were not a large amount of Catholics in the colonies, but we know there were. We know there were in Maryland, for example. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. I'm also not mentioning the Jewish population, which was small but did exist in the Americas, or the Muslim population, which was small but did exist. So we can touch upon that as well. So because of these revivals, these big meetings, like you see here, it had a huge impact on church attendance. So church attendance increased. It affected the way people lived in their homes, what their workplaces was like, what they did for entertainment, and then especially for colleges, which we'll get to in a little bit. Now you may be saying, I thought lots of the people coming to the Americas were religious in the first place. What about the Puritans in the early 1600s? And that is true. That was a big reason why some of the Puritans came, but that's not the only reason people came to America. Remember, many people came more for economic reasons. So here's some of the people and ideas, which we'll go into in more detail. We have John Edwards, and he was a New England preacher, and he really focused on the youth. He would have loved to speak to you guys. There was George Whitefield, and he had these large crowds and really told people to repent and confess their sins. And these different ideas ended up causing some debates because many people that did already belong to a church and were already religious in their own way left those churches and started new ones. And some people weren't happy about that. The old churches were thought to be more rational, and this new movement was all on emotion and feeling, right? And some of the opponents were like, this is too emotional. It's not being rational. However, this movement did cause people to be more tolerant of different beliefs, because now you have a lot of different Protestant denominations. And new ministers said that preaching from that heart, that emotion, was more important than book learning if the heart was filled with Holy Spirit. So what does that suggest about education? So a little bit on some of these preachers. Here is Jonathan Edwards. He was, as I mentioned, from New England. He preached about the need to repent and be converted. Many think he's the most important theologian of the Americas. So theology, right? He was also a major leader in colonial life. So not just in the religious world. He was the third president of Princeton University. And just like, Princeton University is a really, legit school these days, obviously. back then as well. A lot of our founders went to school there. Next, we have Gilbert Tennent. He was from not too far from here. He was from the Middle Colonies. And his father was a Presbyterian minister who started the famous religious school known as the Log College. And the Log College helps to create Princeton. You can look up how they're connected. So the awakening was a reaction against rationalism. Like, everything doesn't have to be so formulated and scientific and rational and logical. You're allowed to make decisions based on your emotions. Yet it led to a founding of a number of colleges, which you think doesn't go hand in hand. Hey, Shanti, trying to record a video here, silly. All right. Many universities other than Princeton were founded during this time, and well-known great schools. Brown, Dartmouth, and New Jersey, Rutgers, one of my alma maters. Okay, George Whitefield. Now notice in that image, he was cross-eyed. So, and even in his paintings, they painted him as being cross-eyed. And he was the most electrifying figure of that area. The real fire and brimstone, people passing out and fainting as he spoke. Hey, dog. Whitefield was an Anglican. So Anglican, remember, from the Church of England. Remember that from your world history, the church that was created when King Henry broke away. He lost favor in England, however, and was expelled. He began to preach in farmers' fields to thousands of people. So this would be like an event. People would drive for days, and they're like horse and buggies, to camp out in these fields, to sit on logs or bales of hay or on the ground to listen to him speak and others speak. And they would speak for hours at a time. All right. Talk about us and our attention spans, that if someone talks more than 15 seconds, we have to pick up our phone because, like, what, do you want me to pay attention for 20 seconds? Like, that's ridiculous, right? For hours. And by nature, he was an actor. So he knew how to project his voice. He knew how to be captivating. He knew how to be dramatic. Right? And he delivered these emotional sermons, and people would be crying and swaying, and and he would shout and cry and start trembling as he spoke of God, right? And he traveled from New England to Georgia, and he's considered by many to be the founder of the evangelical movement, which still exists in America. He was so loved by his followers that during the Revolutionary War, his body, yeah, I read about this, was dug up so that soldiers could take scraps of his clothing with them off to battle. So just, I don't need to say anything about that. He also helped convert slaves and Native Americans to Christianity. He thought that was important. He thought they would go to hell if they were not converted. You can have your own opinion on why that was good or bad. Benjamin Franklin, who I'll talk about again in a minute, we know who he is. He was a religious skeptic. He was not really a religious man by any means. But he became good friends with Whitefield. And he printed many of his sermons. Remember, Ben Franklin was a printer as a career. He gave lots of money to Whitefield as well. So what about education at the time? Did this have an effect in education? It did have an effect because more people learned to read and write because they thought it was important to learn to read the Bible. And by 1647, which is still well before this Great Awakening, right, Massachusetts passed a law requiring parents to teach children to read and understand principles of religion. Like, if you're a parent, can you imagine that? Can you imagine if it was against the law if your parents didn't teach you about religion? I'm sure many of them do, but if they don't, that's not illegal, right? Towns that had 50 families had to hire a teacher. Towns with 100 had to open a whole school. Okay. And here in Massachusetts, they had the first public schools. They were paid for with taxes. And this is important because both the rich and poor could be educated. Primarily, before this, it was often just the rich. In the middle colonies, like where we live now, churches and families set up private schools. Southern colonies really only had tutors, or they sent their children to England. Are there exceptions to all three of these? Yes. Right. That does not mean that no poor children learn to read in the South. Right. This is just what was the social norm at the time. Slaves were really not allowed to get an education of any sort. We'll talk more about that this year. Why was it considered so dangerous? In many places, it was actually illegal to let your slaves learn how to read or write. Lastly, some Enlightenment ideas. You learned a lot about the Enlightenment as a freshman. We were not going to go over all those details, okay? But this idea of the age of reason began in Europe. We learned about all those French philosophers and English ones. And, we can apply these ideas to society. And the better educated of what they could spread these ideas, the reason could improve the world. But remember, this Great Awakening is focusing less on reason and more on emotion. Benjamin Franklin is like our quintessential Enlightenment man, our Renaissance man of the Americas, because he was a scientist. He was into politics. He did invent things, so on and so forth. Okay, so I want to read. I have very many different ideas of the Great Awakening. Why did I focus so much in my graduate studies on the early Republic, but not learn a whole lot about the Great Awakening? I mean, I did, but not as much as, say, like political ideas. And that's because people still have some different ideas about what role it really had in the Americas. There were new ideas going through colonies at the time. It was not just religious ideas, but all sorts of ideas. And I mentioned, Ben Franklin was a printer. All this type of news, all this information, all these ideas could now be more easily printed and sold and get into the hands of more people. And where we live now, right, the two biggest cities where all these ideas were exchanging were New York and Philadelphia. And we live like between that. So this really was like, if you wanted to have exposure to our different ideas, this is where you wanted to live, because this is where you had crops from the South coming up to, things going off to Europe. It was really not just a transportation hub, but an idea hub. And also these ideas about the revolution would soon come this way. So, what did this do? This Great Awakening ended up dividing many colonists, just like other things we learned about. French and Indian War developed some of them. They're not drowning this man, by the way. They're baptizing him in a creek, just so you know. It did create unity with certain national events and shared awareness, like whether you were from Massachusetts. This dog doesn't have fleas, I promise you. She just likes to scratch herself. Or from Virginia, a lot of these common ideas were being shared. The new lights versus the old lights. The new lights were as a nickname for these new revivalists, these new evangelicals, the Whitfields and the Edwards and things. The old lights were the more traditional people, the people that still went to their old churches. And because of this division between the new lights and the old lights, the Presbyterian community was completely split in half. It was in decline by the 1740s, though it still carried on. People were more tolerant of other religions because of this, because there were so many different religions, and no one real religion would dominate. Like we can say, the America has a lot of Protestants, but we can say, oh, mostly Lutherans, or oh, mostly Methodists, or mostly, Episcopalians, right? There's no really one that dominates. Okay, so how did this Great Awakening lead to the revolution? Ministers before this were almost treated like aristocrats, like this noble status. And during this, they're like, no, ministers are just like average people. They're reading their Bible and they're interpreting it just like you or me. They're no one of special, elite status. Some of the new lights actually were sort of dismissive to the power of ministers from the former ways. And a lot of these new forms of Protestantism were more democratic, and those ideas of democracy spread to people's political idea. And the idea of greater equality was a prominent idea of most of them. Does that mean women were treated with greater equality because of this Greater Awakening? Great Awakening? Not really. Slaves? Native Americans? Not really. But did this idea begin to evolve and spread? For sure. So I'm going to conclude. I know this is a longer one of the videos, just a short reading. And when I mentioned, I don't have a lot of information I have a million books, not a million, but of this early republic, and not many really focus on the Great Awakening. So take from that what you will. But this focuses a little bit on the Great Awakening near us. So the Great Awakening was not a unified movement, but rather a series of revivals that swept different regions between 1720 and 1760. So that's close to the years I gave you, with varying degrees of intensity. The first stirrings came in the 1720s in New Jersey, where Dutch Reform Minister Theodore Frelinghuysen, that name Frelinghuysen, that's a big family name in New Jersey, still around, still in our politics. So that's him here on the left. He excited his congregation by emotional preaching about the need to be saved rather than offering the usual theological abstractions. From New Jersey, the awakening spread to Pennsylvania in the 1730s and then to the Connecticut River Valley. There, its greatest preacher was Jonathan Edwards, who we mentioned before, in Northampton, Massachusetts. Later, a philosophical giant in the colonies, Edwards, as a young man, gained renown by frightening his parishioners with the fate of sinners in the hands of an angry God. How manifold have been the abominations of your life? Like, how many sins have you created, right? He atoned. Are there not some here that have debased themselves below the dignity of human nature by wallowing in sensual filthiness as the swine in the mire? Edwards paraded one sin after another before his trembling congregants, and then drew such graphic pictures of hell that they were soon preparing frantically for their conversion, because who wants to go to hell, right? By which they would be born again. And talks about things that he published. In 1739, these regional brush friars of evangelicalism were drawn together by a 24-year-old Anglican priest from England, George Whitefield. I mentioned him before. Inspired by John Wesley, who's the guy in the center. Notice how they all look sort of similar here. The founder of English Methodism, Whitefield used his magnificent speaking voice in dramatic, spontaneous, open-air preaching before huge gatherings. Whitefield barnstormed 7 times along the American seaboard, beginning in 1739 and 1740. With each success, his fame and influence grew. In Boston, he preached to 19,000 people in 3 days. Right? This is before there was like Madison Square Gardens, right? There were no Meadowlands. Like, these are just people all out on fields listening. And at a farewell sermon, left 25,000 people at once, writhing in fear of damnation. In his wake came American preachers whom he inspired, like Devereux Jarrett, who's there on the right. You see people like trembling and falling over once again. An important part of the awakening was lay exhorting, which horrified most established clergymen. Exhorting meant that anyone, young or old, female or male, black or white, spontaneously preached about his or her conversion. So you don't think you can talk and tell someone about how you were converted and how that saved you, and hopefully that will inspire them. You don't need like a minister or a priest to do it for you. So this shattered the trained clergy's monopoly and gave new importance to the oral culture of ordinary people, whose, and see why I said it was more democratic, right? Whose impromptu outpourings contrasted sharply with the controlled literary culture of the gentry, so like the noble classes. Through lay exhorting, all manner of ordinary people, including children, servants, and slaves, defied assigned roles. So they were showing that they could have a say and they had some power as well. How religion, social change, and politics became interwoven in the Great Awakening can be seen by examining 2 regions swept by revivalism. Both Boston, the heartland of Puritanism, and interior Virginia, a land of struggling small planters and slave-rich aristocrats, experienced the Great Awakening, but in different ways and at different times. So we did enough for today. We'll get to those differences next time. All right. So let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk about this soon.